Welcome back, starters. Part two. We have our battery. We've talked a lot about batteries. The battery is the first leg of this tripod that we covered of the battery starting and charging. Those three guys are interrelated. They have to support each other. Uh, we have to check our battery to make sure that it has, enough current to get the starter cranking and the engine started. And then the alternator has to pick up and recharge the battery. Uh, uh, and if I have a no start, no crank, no stir, this would be the first place I would start in any diagnosis. Always check your battery first. Always check the battery cables first. I'll show you how to do that in another video. And we got cables and wire. Now, voltage drops are your friend. I will be showing you how to do this, uh, and we'll talk about it. And you can see, like this picture here, this is just, I'm checking the connection between the positive battery cable, actually negative battery cable, and the cable clamp itself. I'm checking this connection right here. So I can check all these connections, and I'm going to be showing you how to do that in a separate video. The ignition switch itself. Ignition switch are just complicated switches. We can check it for mechanical faults. We can do a voltage drop across the ignition switch. That's fairly easy to do. But there are many, many switches in a lot of ignition switches. I'll be talking about that when we do the voltage drops. But we're just interested in the one that goes on and off when you go to crank, the stir connection. And generally that's just one connection. There may be a relay involved, and we'll talk about that more when we get to that part. Burned contacts gives us a voltage drop, and we can check it. A lot of times these ignition switches are really a pain to get to. They are difficult to get to for a reason. It's specifically so you can't do like in the movies and like reach up underneath there and rip some wires down, and they are specifically in a inaccessible position. They make it hard. Voltage drops are your friend again. Neutral safety switch. 9 times out of 10, these are wired in series with the ignition switch. So these are on the S line. And it's used to prevent starter engagement, anything other than park and neutral. Most people do not start their car in neutral. Most people start their car in park. But if you suspect that it's a bad neutral safety switch, one of the other things that is in the switch is over here. This is my backup lights. So, I want to check and see if my neutral safety switch is okay. I'm going to quickly check and see if I have backup lights because it's the same switch. It could be that it's out of adjustment. I've had cars where the shifter cable has stretched to the point where it's not actually shifting it into park. It's kind of sort of in park. So I'll shift it into reverse and look and see if the backup lights light up. And then sometimes what I'll do is, if I suspect it's a bad neutral safety switch, I'll just turn the key to start and hold it and shift the shifter back a bunch of times, see if, if I hear the starter, like, I'm shifting the shifter back and forth a bunch of times and I hear the starters try to engage, I'm fairly certain that it's bad neutral safety switch at that point. Relays and solenoids. We've talked about relays. You've looked at relays. Remember, there's two different sides. There's the load side and the control side. High current side is the low side. Low current side is controlled generally by an outside switch or switches. And this S line that we're talking about can be kind of tricky. We'll look at one. Use the computer. And then the mechanical properties, the pinions and flywheels. This is the mechanical connection between the starter and the motor. I don't know how many times I've heard, like, in parking lots or a gas station or something, and somebody's trying to start their car, and it just sounds terrible. I mean, it's like, whoa, dude, man, this is a mechanical issue. And I'm just picking on GMs. GM has for years used these, shims to adjust the starter. I don't know why GM can't make it the mechanical connection of the starter and the motor a little better, but they have these shims to adjust the meshing of the gears. If it's meshed too much, it binds, or if it meshes too little, it creates a hell of a racket in there. Anyways, and it does need to be inspected. And generally, if I'm replacing the starter, I'm going to go look at this and look for any obvious like teeth missing or any wear problems or a bent flywheel, which can happen. Just checking. And it needs to be properly aligned. Testing. Well, slow crank, no crank, buzzing and clicking, humming. Yeah, all these grinding, good crank, but still not starting. All of these are issues. And honestly, here's what I'm looking at. Somebody calls me in the middle of the night and they want me to come out because their car won't start. I'm going to ask them a couple of questions on this. I don't want to get out of bed if it really needs a tow truck. I mean, I can send them an Uber if I have to. Anyways. Testing. Starters. 3. Ready? All right. We got some problems that go along with this. What are we looking at? Well, slow crank. We all know that from being around here in the winter. Good noise, huh? We got no crank, where you turn the key and nothing happens. We also have, buzzing or clicking, where it goes click, 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 or, we've all dealt with those here in Chicago. Humming, grinding, and then, it cranks, but it still doesn't start. I mean, what do all these mean? Well, I'm going to run through them one at a time. Slower, no crank. Slower than normal or not at all. We've all heard this. It could be caused by, low state of charge in the battery, bad or not being charged correctly, so that would be the alternator, or poor electrical connections, which is really kind of common. Overheated wires is another one. Buzzing or clicking. This is usually caused by a discharged battery. Could also be resistance in the battery connections, voltage drop. I'll be testing that stuff. A single click without cranking could be caused by a bad starter motor, or even engine mechanical damage, or a defective solenoid, or a battery problem. Could be caused as simple as a frozen locked up water pump. I've had those happen, or a locked up alternator, or any of the accessory drive stuff causing this buzzing or even a slow crank. Grinding noises. Usually this indicates mechanical defects. The pinion isn't meshing right with the ring gear, or excessively worn or broken components. And this would require removal of the starter, and in some cases removal of the transmission in order to get at it. That's pretty rare. Headlight test. I use this test, especially if I'm like looking at a car in a parking lot. A friend or a relative has called me, my car doesn't start and it's cold out. I can get them to do this, while I'm on the phone with them, and it'll tell me very quickly whether or not, it's a starter issue, it's a battery issue. I can decide if I can fix it in the parking lot or if it needs to be towed somewhere. Because I am too old to be working in a parking lot at a grocery store or something. Just not going to do it anymore. So, I just ask them to turn on the headlights. If they have no crank and no headlights, those should be battery hot all the time. Turn on the headlights and you got no headlights. Well, that's a bad connection, or, bad battery connection, or a bad battery. A jump may get them moving. If the lights go out during crank, the lights come on and they're maybe kind of dim, or they're not working very well, turn the key, and if the lights go out, it could mean, an increase in amperage draw due to a mechanical issue. Or more than likely, it's just a weak battery. I showed you before when we were testing battery, it has plenty of volts. It'll light up a battery or light up a light, but it may not have enough amperage available to crank the starter, the stir part. The lights stay bright during crank, which generally means there's a resistance or an open circuit. Think, anti-theft is kicked in. We'll talk a small little bit about that. Or or you know, there's high resistance in the big fat B line that runs down to the battery, or there's something wrong with the S line, you know, which that's real common. I think neutral safety switch, ignition switch, or anti-theft is on that line. So it's just my simple, fast headlight test. I can also utilize my dome light if I can't see the headlights, like it's during the day. Just open the door and have a look at the dome light to run this test as well. But the headlights really should be on during this test as well. Okay, so what if the engine cranks fine? Well, then it's probably not a starter issue. That's a drivability issue. That's something completely different, covered in other classes. You know, no crank, no start. And honestly, this is one thing you have to ask people, especially if they're not, you know, car people. Well, my car doesn't start. Well, what exactly does that mean? Does it mean that it goes stir and it's just not going room starting? Or, you know, does it not go stir? Those are two completely different problems that, you know, that need a separate, different diagnosis. You know, you have to qualify these questions, especially with customers or with friends or relatives that you're looking at their car for, because most people don't realize that my car doesn't start isn't descriptive enough for us. All right, so did you notice what the major problem was? What's the first thing you got to check when you have a no crank, no start diagnosis in front of you? Well, first thing to start with is the battery. You got to start with the battery. You got to check the connections on the battery first before you condemn the starter. Got it?